That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The moment Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the moon is an iconic image, an achievement that would not have happened without the driving force of innovative ideas of our far-reaching past. If you're thinking these innovations were in the science of aviation, you are wrong. It wasn't aerodynamics or even engineering either. What marvel of modernization is the cornerstone to all modern technology and advancements? The answer is pedagogy. By definition, is the art and science of educating, or more simply put, teaching. When writing developed, it prompted the first innovation in teaching, organized schools dedicated to education. Around 3000 BC, the Egyptians formed temple schools where priests taught religion, writing, and some of the sciences. They also created a writing medium from the papyrus plant, giving us the origin of the word paper. Paper not only sped up the development of education, but much of what is known about these schools has come from these ancient documents, some of them the oldest in existence. Soon, religious schools began appearing around the globe. In 2000 BC, they arrived in China, followed 500 years later by temple schools developed in India. The next major educational innovation occurred in 850 BC, as Greek culture began to develop. The epic poems, the Iliad and Odyssey, debuted and became required reading for young boys, making them examples of some of the earliest history textbooks. Like modern history books, they introduced tales of Greek mythology and the Trojan War. Greek society led the way for innovation in pedagogy through the appearance of sophists, wandering teachers who taught anyone who would listen, holding informal classes in public squares and gathering places. They introduced a new aspect of teaching called critical thinking. Their students were encouraged to argue with logic, and the sophists put an emphasis on finding the truth, rather than simply winning an argument. Even today we study the works of famous sophists, including those written by the philosopher Socrates. As the BC era drew to a close, two new philosophies of education were introduced by Roman citizens. The first came from Marcus Tullius Cicero, who introduced the concept that education should be broad in both the arts and sciences. The second was an idea introduced by Marcus Fabius Quintilianus, who believed education should be based on the student's ability to learn. These educational approaches are still in use today. Although much shorter than the preceding time period, the years leading up to the Middle Ages were quite active for formal education. The universities of Constantinople and Nalanda were founded, considered to be the greatest universities in recorded history. In 597 CE, the King's School in Canterbury, one of the earliest grammar schools, opened its doors and began teaching philosophy and medicine. During the Middle Ages, the social and political environment was not conducive to progress in teaching methods. It was years before humanity began to once again value education in its development. Beginning around 1450, a major shift in thinking began to take place. The time period is called the Renaissance, a French word that means rebirth. Many historians believe that the Renaissance is the beginning of modern history. Europeans began to explore new lands, and scholars expanded their knowledge of all subjects. Pedagogy yet again experienced a period of innovation. In 1499, Desiderius Erasmus, a Dutch teacher, began researching ancient documents. He revolutionized the existing educational system by encouraging teachers in Europe to apply the critical thinking of the sophists to the literature they read, not just memorize it and repeat it to their students. With the invention of the printing press, people began to read again. This new freedom of ideas created a more informed population, and people began to challenge the authority of the Pope. This eventually led to the Protestant Reformation, with reformers starting schools where people could be taught to read in their native languages. It was an innovative approach, a step towards separation of religion and education, as well as the first example of education approached from the needs of the students. In 1799, Johann Pestalozzi, a Swiss educator, established schools throughout Switzerland and Germany that used object lessons, the senses, and expression to help children learn, founding the first modern elementary schools. During this time, Napoleon's French Empire began attacking the surrounding countries. Much of Great Britain's taxes were going to fund the war effort, and education suffered. However, following Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815 and the Second Treaty of Paris, Britain redirected some of its military allotment to education, breaking church and private monopolies and starting a public educational system. Furthering the early education ideal, Frederick Froebel established the first kindergarten in 1837, a place where young children could grow and learn before entering elementary school. In 1852, free education developed in the United States, starting in Massachusetts. In 1860, English poet and philosopher John Locke introduced the idea that we are born with blank minds, and education should gradually develop them from an early age. This idea of early development has been reinforced by science, and in modern society, children can begin their education while still infants. As the world moved into the modern era, its population climbed to over 1 billion. Inventions were unveiled in record numbers. Henry Ford created his first car, the first radio telephone was introduced, and the Wright brothers attempted flight. Education was also developing, with more focus placed on the act of educating. It was during this time that Maria Montessori developed her approach to education. The Montessori method was a philosophy of teaching young children sensory, practical, and formal skills. The ideas are still in use today, practiced by many kindergarten and preschool classes. In 1916, the book Democracy in Education was published, written by John Dewey, an American philosopher, psychologist, and educational reformer, who introduced the philosophy of education. As World War I was ending, the United States began to focus inward, finally declaring that education should be free for everyone, and everyone had to go to school. Just as it seemed education would have its pivotal moment, the Great Depression hit. People suffered under the strain of the economic situation, and education suffered yet again. Children were forced to drop out of school to work, while a lack of incoming taxes resulted in very low funding for schools. There were very few teachers and no money for supplies. Eventually, 3 million students were left with no school to go to, as many of them closed. Amazingly, a new teaching style developed during these tough times. Based on the teaching philosophy of John Dewey, Charles Sanders Peirce, and William James, teachers began to allow students to choose what they wanted to learn, often letting students work in groups, doing art and science projects, and learning song and dances. Many parents were against these methods. They wanted their children to only learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. After the Depression, philosophers, teachers, and scientists once again turned their attention to pedagogy. The Process of Education, written by Jerome Bruner, was published and influenced the thinking of many teachers in the United States. Still considered to be one of the most important books on education, it helped form a more institutional approach to learning. In 1968, Paulo Freire wrote the book Pedagogy of the Repressed, which examined the struggle for justice and equality within the educational system, and proposed a new pedagogy, a philosophy aimed at teaching students based on a combination of their abilities as well as a socio-economic basis. Mr. Freire was considered the leading expert in the history and development of pedagogy and is still held in high regards. Other educators that were influential during this time period include the Kagan team and Benjamin Bloom. During the following years, technology expanded rapidly. Computers were invented, the internet became popular, and advancements were made in science and math. Schools raced to catch up. Today, new information pours out of science labs so rapidly that books are seemingly obsolete almost upon publication. Schools have begun to explore different means of teaching, working with research institutes and colleges to create science and engineering classes aimed at taking the learning experience out of the classroom. With direct access to scientists and researchers, the students have immediate access to relevant information. Hands-on learning allows for different educational opportunities than those available in regular classes. An example of this immersive approach can be found in the Marine Oceanography Academy, a program run by the St. Lucie County School Board, Florida Atlantic University, and Harbor Branch Oceanographic Research Institute. The school incorporates a small learning community with an integrated curriculum that allows students to experience real-world challenges while still getting an exceptional education.
Programs like these define innovation, showing just how far pedagogy has come. The differences in the human race as a culture, in how we think, and the ways our society is developed are all reflected in our educational methods. What makes innovation of pedagogy so special, though, is not its lengthy history or influences from thousands of people, but the end result of it all, the things students go on to do in their lives, using the knowledge they learned in school to further the progress of humanity. Consider Neil Armstrong. Someone was once his teacher, who was also a teacher once, and so on, reaching all the way back to ancient Egypt.
The world is moving at a tremendous rate. No one knows where. We must prepare our children not for the world of the past, not for our world, but for their world, the world of the future.